At precisely 9:42 in the morning on the 13th day of July in the year 1944, Sergeant Curtis Culin observed General Omar Bradley disembark from a jeep near Stl. He understood that the ensuing 30 seconds would dictate whether 3,000 American tanks possessed the capability to penetrate the dense hedgerow terrain of Normandy. At 29 years of age, having spent a mere 2 weeks testing his invention with zero prior authorization, Culin knew the stakes. The First Army had already sustained losses exceeding 400 Sherman tanks in their 6-week futile attempts to traverse the Norman bocage. These were not ordinary hedges, they were earthen ramparts, 12 feet in height and 4 feet thick, fortified over centuries by resilient root systems. For generations, French farmers had erected stone boundaries along property lines since medieval times. Soil accumulated, trees took root, and these natural fortifications became formidable obstacles. When American tanks attempted to surmount these ancient barriers, their vulnerable underbellies were exposed. German Panzerfaust units and anti-tank artillery readily targeted this weak point. Tragically, most Sherman crews perished before they could even egress their burning vehicles. Cullen's own detachment, the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, a component of the 2nd Armored Division, had been diligently scouting these formidable hedgerows since the 20th of June. The underlying mathematics were stark and lethal. Each infantry battalion typically comprised around 70 tanks. Command had initially assigned 4 M4 dozer tanks, equipped with bulldozer blades, per battalion. While these dozers could indeed breach the hedgerows, their slow speed made them prime targets for German gunners. From the 6th of June to the 10th of July, Allied forces had managed to advance a mere 8 miles inland. Thousands of these hedgerow fields still lay between the beachhead and the open French countryside. At this incremental pace, the First Army would require an estimated 6 months to cover an additional 20 miles. Operation Cobra, the meticulously planned breakout offensive, necessitated swift armored progression through the bocage. No one had yet devised a viable tactical solution to this persistent challenge. Engineers had experimented with packing explosives into the bases of the hedgerows, but the resulting detonations barely scathed the earthen walls and only served to draw German artillery fire. Some tank crews resorted to welding spare track links onto their hulls for added protection, a measure effective against machine gun fire but utterly useless against Panzerfaust rounds fired from mere yards away. Other crews attempted to ram the hedgerows at full speed, only to have their Shermans bury themselves nose first into earth and roots compacted over 500 years. Sergeant Culin, however, had spent 3 days meticulously constructing his own solution, repurposing German beach obstacles. These formidable devices, known as Czech hedgehogs, consisted of 3 railway iron beams welded into a formidable jack-like configuration. The Germans had strategically deployed thousands of them on invasion beaches to cripple landing craft. American engineers, having acquired and subsequently dismantled these obstacles, stockpiled the salvaged steel. Culin appropriated 4 sections of this resilient hedgehog steel, each piece a formidable 2 inches thick, and expertly welded them to the bow plate of a light tank. The prongs were angled forward at a 35-degree inclination. The ingenious design dictated that upon encountering a hedgerow, these steel tusks would dig into the base, effectively propelling the tank forward rather than forcing it to climb. This prevented the exposure of the tank's vulnerable underbelly. He subjected this innovative device to 7 rigorous tests on a light tank, each instance resulting in a successful breach. Subsequently, Major Sidney Bingham of the 2nd Armored Division sanctioned a test utilizing a full-weight Sherman tank. This formidable Sherman tipped the scales at 33 tons, more than double the 15 tons of a light tank. The increased impact force raised concerns that the prongs might shear off the bow plate or even cause the tank to flip forward. Lieutenant Charles Green, a member of the 747th Tank Battalion, bravely volunteered his crew for the critical test. On the 11th of July, the 4-prong assembly, weighing a substantial 320 pounds, was affixed to Green's Sherman. The initial test run on July 12 proved successful. 4 subsequent tests yielded the same positive outcome, the prongs held firm. Word of this groundbreaking development rapidly reached General Bradley's headquarters. He personally commanded a demonstration for the 13th of July. Pointing to a hedgerow approximately 200 yards distant, a 12-foot-high, fortress-like barrier that had effectively halted American armor for 42 days, Bradley awaited the demonstration. Lieutenant Green ascended to his commander's hatch, while his gunner, Sergeant Frank Weber, sealed the turret. The driver engaged the engine. Sergeant Culin stood beside General Bradley, observing as the Sherman maneuvering into position 50 yards from the target hedgerow. Lieutenant Green's voice crackled over the radio, signaling his readiness to execute the hedgerow breach. General Bradley raised his binoculars. "Proceed," he commanded. The Sherman accelerated to 25 miles per hour. The four steel prongs struck the earthen wall with a sound akin to a freight train collision. Dirt erupted upwards as the tank's nose dipped momentarily. For 3 agonizing seconds, the Sherman contended with 500 years of compacted earth and interwoven root systems. Then, with a decisive crunch, the prongs tore through. The hedgerow collapsed inwards. The Sherman burst through the opposing side in a mere 14 seconds. General Bradley lowered his binoculars, walked to the newly formed gap, touched the torn earth, and examined the severed roots. He then turned to Major General Leonard J. Rooks. "How many of these can we produce?" he inquired. Major General Rooks glanced at Sergeant Culin. "The beach obstacles provide enough steel for approximately 500 devices," he responded. "I want 3,000, General Bradley declared. "If you wish to witness if Cullen's beach debris cutters truly performed effectively in combat, press that like button immediately and subscribe, because what transpires next is utterly astonishing." Now, back to Cullen. That evening, General Bradley issued urgent directives to the 52nd Ordnance Group. Every available welder in Normandy would be assigned to 24-hour shifts, tasked with dismantling every German beach obstacle situated between the beachhead and Cherbourg. The directive mandated the installation of the cutting device onto every Sherman, every light tank, and every tank destroyer within the First Army. Operation Cobra was officially slated to commence on the 25th of July, a mere 12 days hence. The Ordnance Group faced the monumental task of modifying 3,000 armored vehicles before the offensive could launch. This translated to an astonishing 250 tanks per day, or 10 tanks every hour, demanding the completion of 1 tank modification every 6 minutes. Sergeant Culin had precisely 12 days to ascertain whether his humble, salvaged invention would shatter the battlefield stalemate or prove utterly insignificant when confronted by German anti-tank artillery. Captain James D.Y. of the 52nd Ordnance Group arrived at the designated production site near Corentin on the 14th of July, accompanied by 30 welders and 6 cutting torch rigs. He meticulously outlined the assembly process on a field table, cut hedgehog beams into 4-foot sections, grind the edges to sharp points, weld them to mounting plates, and finally, bolt the plates to the tank's bow. The estimated time for each vehicle, assuming perfect conditions, was 4 hours. However, perfection was a luxury they did not possess. The hedgehog steel proved considerably harder than standard construction-grade steel, causing the cutting torches to overheat after merely 20 minutes, necessitating extended cooling periods. The inaugural day of production yielded a meager 8 completed devices, a starkly insufficient 8 tanks out of the required 3,000. At this rate, the Ordnance Group would not finish the modifications until sometime in October, meaning Operation Cobra would launch without this critical enhancement. Sergeant Culin dedicated the 15th of July to troubleshooting the production line. The primary issue stemmed from excessive heat buildup in the torch tips. The German steel absorbed thermal energy at a slower rate than its American counterpart, leading to the premature failure of the cutting equipment. He requisitioned additional torch assemblies from the engineering depot and reorganized the welders into rotation shifts, allowing one team to cut while another's equipment cooled. Production saw a modest increase to 22 devices on July 15. Still, this remained insufficient. Captain D.Y. procured 40 more welders from maintenance battalions across Normandy. By July 17, daily production had climbed to 38 devices. The mathematical reality, however, remained grim. 3,000 tanks at a rate of 38 per day would require a total of 79 days. Operation Cobra was scheduled to launch in just 8 days. The welding process revealed another significant challenge. The four-prong assembly, weighing 320 pounds, shifted the tank's center of gravity forward by 6 inches when bolted to the Sherman's bow. This resulted in significant compression of the front suspension. Following repeated hedgerow impacts, stress fractures began appearing on the suspension springs of several test vehicles. Should these springs fail in combat, the tank would be rendered immobile, its front end crippled. Sergeant Culin devised a modification to the mounting system. Instead of directly bolting the prongs to the bow plate, he incorporated reinforcement brackets designed to distribute the weight across the whole structural frame. This enhancement added an additional 30 minutes to each installation but effectively prevented suspension damage. By July 19, a mere 6 days before Operation Cobra, production had surged to 64 devices per day. The Ordnance Group had successfully completed approximately 400 modifications, leaving a daunting 2,600 tanks yet to be processed. General Bradley's staff dispatched a priority message. The general required a minimum of 2,000 Rhino tanks for the impending offensive. Failure to meet this target risked delaying Operation Cobra, a delay that would allow the Germans to further reinforce their bocage defenses. Every day of delay translated directly into an unacceptable loss of life. Captain Doherty, in a desperate search for additional materials, discovered more Czech hedgehog stockpiles near Utah Beach. Transportation units worked tirelessly on July 20 to haul these obstacles inland. The Ordnance Group now possessed sufficient raw material for 5,000 devices. The critical bottleneck had shifted to welding capacity. Sergeant Culin contacted maintenance sections from units not slated for Cobra's initial assault wave. Tank recovery teams, equipped with welding apparatus for field repairs, were mobilized. He organized them into auxiliary production cells, and by July 21, 15 additional welding stations were operational, propelling production to 112 devices per day. The pressure of the impending deadline intensified. Welders labored through the night under powerful floodlights powered by mobile generators. The production site transformed into a scene reminiscent of an industrial factory transplanted into a Norman field. Sparks from cutting torches illuminated rows of tanks awaiting modification, and the pungent aroma of hot metal and welding flux permeated the air. Sleep became a luxury, with most personnel managing no more than 4 hours. By July 22, just 3 days before Operation Cobra, the total production count had reached 1,200 devices. Captain Doherty calculated that an additional 850 could be installed before the offensive commenced, bringing the total to approximately 2,500 Rhino tanks, a figure just exceeding General Bradley's minimum requirement. Then, the steel ran out. The hedgehog stockpiles were entirely depleted. The Ordnance Group had processed every German beach obstacle situated between the beachhead and Cherbourg. Engineers managed to locate approximately 300 more hedgehogs scattered across minor beach exits, but transportation resources were diverted to the critical movement of ammunition and fuel for Operation Cobra. These remaining obstacles would not arrive in time. Captain Doherty began exploring alternative materials. Railroad tracks emerged as a viable substitute for hedgehog steel. While softer than the German steel, they were readily available in substantial quantities. Several units had already experimented with railroad-based designs. Lieutenant Charles Green's battalion, the 747th, had indeed welded massive railroad tie prongs onto several tanks, dubbing their creation the Green Dozer. Though the railroad prongs were heavier and cruder than Cullen's design, they proved effective. The Ordnance Group consequently shifted to a hybrid production model, Sergeant Cullen's hedgehog cutters for units still possessing adequate steel, and railroad prongs for all other installations. By July 23, 2 days prior to Operation Cobra, the production count reached 1,800 devices. An additional 500 were in progress utilizing railroad steel, bringing the final estimated total to 2,300 Rhino tanks, representing 77% of General Bradley's armored force. It was not the desired 3,000, nor was it perfect, but it was deemed sufficient. The modified tanks were transferred to forward assembly areas on July 24. Sergeant Culin walked through the staging zones near Marigny, observing column after column of Shermans rolling past. Each and every tank was adorned with 4 steel prongs on its bow. They appeared almost comical, like prehistoric beasts outfitted for combat. Operation Cobra was scheduled to commence with a massive aerial bombardment at dawn on July 25. 3,000 Allied aircraft were poised to release 4,000 tons of explosives upon German positions. Following this devastating prelude, the armor would advance through the bocage, employing Sergeant Culin's ingenious devices to breach the very hedgerows the Germans believed impregnable. Sergeant Culin, having gone without sleep for 72 hours and his hands bearing the marks of burns from handling hot metal, stood in that field, observing the assembling tanks. A profound realization washed over him: those steel prongs represented the potential survival of 14,000 men who might otherwise perish during the bocage breakout. 14,000 soldiers who would not be consumed by flames, their tanks' vulnerable bellies exposed to enemy guns. Whether these devices would truly perform in the crucible of combat would be determined in approximately 9 hours. On July 25, at precisely 6:11 in the morning, the ground nearest T.L. trembled as 1,500 Allied bombers unleashed 4,000 tons of explosives upon German fortifications. Sergeant Culin, positioned at a forward observation post 3 miles behind the start line, witnessed the aerial assault. The bombardment raged for 90 minutes. When it finally ceased, an unnerving silence descended upon the battlefield. At 7:45 in the morning, the first Rhino tanks cautiously advanced into the bocage. The 2nd Armored Division spearheaded the assault, followed closely by the 3rd Armored Division. The 1st Infantry Division provided crucial support. Every tank carried either Sergeant Culin's signature 4-prong device or its railroad-based variant. Radio reports began flooding in at 8:15 in the morning. Company B of the 2nd Armored Division had successfully reached their initial hedgerow objective. The lead Sherman accelerated to 25 miles per hour and struck the earthen wall. The prongs dug in with remarkable efficacy, and the tank surged through in a mere 16 seconds. The crew reported no damage to the device or the suspension system. More encouraging reports followed. Company C breached 3 consecutive hedgerows in under 20 minutes. Company A, with relentless momentum, pushed through 5 continuous hedgerow lines without pausing. This remarkable pattern repeated across the entire assault front. Tanks that, under normal circumstances, would have required hours to advance across a single field were now traversing multiple hedgerows in a matter of minutes. The Germans were utterly unprepared for this tactical paradigm shift. Their defensive doctrine was predicated on the assumption that American tanks would attempt to scale the hedgerows, thereby exposing their vulnerable underbellies. Panzerfaust units had positioned themselves for upward shots at these predictable weak points, and anti-tank guns were meticulously aimed at these designated climb points. When the Rhino tanks, with their innovative devices, punched straight through at ground level, the Germans' carefully calculated firing solutions became rendered utterly useless. By 10:30 in the morning, the 2nd Armored Division had advanced 2 miles inland, a feat that would typically have taken them 3 days. The 3rd Armored Division reported similarly impressive progress. The formidable bocage defensive network was rapidly collapsing, its terrain advantage completely nullified. Hedgerows that had effectively immobilized American tanks for 6 weeks were now reduced to mere obstacles, delaying advances by a mere 15 seconds. However, the devices were not entirely without flaw. Reports of failures began filtering in around 11 o'clock in the morning. One Sherman from the 741st Tank Battalion encountered a hedgerow with a deeply embedded stone foundation. The impact caused the prongs to bend backward, rendering the tank incapable of moving either forward or in reverse. The crew was forced to abandon the vehicle under heavy machine gun fire, resulting in the tragic loss of 2 men during their egress. Another failure occurred at 11:20. The prongs of a light tank's device snapped off entirely when they struck an iron fence post concealed within the hedgerow's base. The tank commander reported that the device had been ripped away, taking a portion of the bow plate with it. While the tank remained combat effective, its ability to breach further hedgerows was compromised. A third incident occurred at noon. A tank destroyer equipped with railroad prongs collided with a hedgerow at an excessive speed of 30 miles per hour. The sheer force of the impact buckled the mounting brackets, causing the prongs to twist sideways and jam the right track, immobilizing the vehicle. The overall failure rate stood at approximately 4%, 4 failed breaches for every 100 attempts. While not catastrophic, this percentage was significant. 4% of the 2,300 tanks meant that 92 devices would likely fail during Operation Cobra. This translated to 92 crews potentially trapped in exposed fields with enemy guns bearing down on them. Sergeant Culin, from his vantage point at the observation post, monitored the radio traffic. The majority of the reports were overwhelmingly positive, detailing tanks advancing at a pace unseen since D-Day. Yet, those persistent failure reports gnawed at him. 4%. 92 tanks. Potentially 460 men. At 1:30 in the afternoon, a report arrived that fundamentally altered the landscape of the offensive. A battalion from the 3rd Armored Division had successfully reached the Marigny-St. Gillian Road, a critical objective 4 miles inland. This 4-mile advance had been achieved in a mere 6 hours, a distance that had taken 2 weeks to cover back in June. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, forward elements had penetrated 5 miles inland. German units, unable to establish new defensive lines with sufficient speed, began a disorganized retreat. The bocage terrain, once their formidable protector, had become a useless obstacle. American armor surged through it as if it were open country. General Bradley's headquarters issued an assessment at 4:15 in the afternoon. Operation Cobra was exceeding all projections. The Rhino tanks had definitively resolved the bocage problem. Estimated German casualties were reportedly 3 times higher than American losses. The grinding defensive stalemate had been decisively broken. Sergeant Culin departed the observation post at 5 o'clock in the evening, driving back toward the production site at Corentin. The welding stations, now abandoned, stood silent, all available tanks having moved forward. The field was eerily empty, save for scattered steel scraps and discarded, burnt-out torch tips. He sat upon the hood of a jeep, attempting to process the momentous events of the past few weeks. A simple sketch on a ration box 3 weeks prior. Beach obstacle steel welded to tank bows. And now, the entire Normandy front was in motion, propelled by tanks capable of punching through hedgerows instead of precariously climbing over them. The 4% failure rate still troubled him. It signified that the design was not perfect, susceptible to variables like buried stone foundations, hidden fence posts, and excessive impact speeds, factors he hadn't fully accounted for during testing. 92 crews, he reflected, were paying the price for these oversights. Yet, 2,200 devices had performed admirably, enabling 14,000 men to advance through terrain that should have proven their undoing. The mathematics were brutal, but undeniably clear. A 4% failure rate was a vastly preferable outcome compared to the 60% casualty rates previously experienced due to exposed belly armor. As the sun began to set, he could still hear the distant rumble of artillery fire. The front had advanced an astonishing 8 miles inland in a single day. The bocage lay behind them. On July 26, General Bradley's headquarters issued further production orders for additional hedge cutters. Units advancing beyond the bocage were encountering sporadic hedgerow formations in the interior regions of France. The devices, it was determined, remained strategically useful. The Ordnance Group received authorization to produce an additional 500 units utilizing the remaining railroad steel. By July 28, the production count had reached 2,850 modified tanks, representing approximately 60% of the First Army's armored vehicles. The remaining 40% comprised specialized vehicles incapable of mounting the devices or units held in reserve. The geographic impact of the modifications was remarkable. The 2nd Armored Division employed Rhino tanks from St. L to Coutances. The 3rd Armored Division utilized them from Marigny to Avranches. The 1st Infantry Division deployed them during the Mortain counterattack. The 4th Armored Division received their devices on July 30 and employed them in their advance towards Brittany. Different units ingeniously adapted the basic design. The 747th Tank Battalion favored the robust railroad prongs, while the 2nd Armored Division standardized on Sergeant Culin's lighter hedgehog steel variant. Some tank destroyer units opted for shorter, 3-prong configurations to preserve turret traverse. Light tank crews utilized 2-prong versions to minimize weight. Maintenance units developed efficient field repair procedures. Bent prongs could be straightened with hydraulic jacks, and broken welds could be mended in approximately 30 minutes. Completely destroyed devices could be replaced within 2 hours, provided spare prongs were readily available. The production site at Corentin transformed into a vital repair depot, diligently processing damaged devices and returning them to operational service. The tactical ramifications extended far beyond simple hedgerow breaching. German units were forced to retreat at an accelerated pace, unable to establish coherent defensive positions. Panzer divisions withdrew towards the Seine River. American armor advanced an impressive 40 miles in just 8 days. The Falaise Pocket, a devastating encirclement, formed precisely because German units were unable to escape the relentless American advance. Rhino tanks effectively blocked vital retreat routes through the bocage terrain. Intelligence reports gathered from captured German officers offered a fascinating glimpse into their perspective. They referred to the devices as hedge devils or iron tusks. Several prisoners recounted abandoning their defensive positions upon realizing that American tanks could breach any hedgerow. One German company commander reported that his anti-tank gun crew had fled their positions after witnessing 3 Shermans effortlessly punch through hedgerows they had considered utterly impenetrable. By August 5, the bocage campaign was effectively concluded. Allied forces had successfully broken through into the open French countryside. The hedgerow obstacle, which had halted their advance for 6 critical weeks, had been vanquished in just 12 days. General Bradley's staff calculated that the Rhino devices had accelerated the breakout by an estimated 4 to 6 weeks. The statistical impact was profound. Between July 25 and August 10, American tank casualties plummeted by 37% compared to the figures from June and early July. This represented approximately 300 tanks that were not destroyed and 1,500 crew members who were neither killed nor wounded. The 4% device failure rate paled in comparison to this dramatic reduction in casualties. Not all units retained their devices indefinitely. As tanks advanced beyond Normandy into regions devoid of dense hedgerow formations, crews began removing the prongs. The considerable 320-pound weight penalty negatively impacted fuel consumption and reduced top speeds on paved roads. By mid-August, approximately 40% of Rhino tanks had had their cutters removed. However, some units elected to retain them. The 4th Armored Division continued to utilize their devices through September, encountering occasional hedgerow terrain in eastern France. The 2nd Armored Division stored the removed prongs on supply trucks, ready for immediate reinstallation should the need arise. Several tank destroyer battalions kept lighter versions permanently mounted. These ingenious devices remained in active service on September 2, the day American forces liberated Paris. A select few Rhino tanks proudly participated in the Liberation Parade, their distinctive steel prongs still visible on their bow plates. Unaware of their significance, French civilians observed these unusual metal tusks with a mixture of curiosity and wonder. American tank crews understood that those metal extensions represented the crucial difference between perishing in a French field or successfully reaching Paris. Culin, reassigned to training duties by Bradley's staff to instruct new tank crews on hedgerow tactics, observed the advance from Normandy. Throughout August, he focused on demonstrating breach techniques at a practice area near Azen. On the 15th of that month, a messenger arrived with a dispatch from Bradley's command, summoning him immediately and without any stated reason. Driving to headquarters, Culin harbored concerns, wondering if something had gone awry, perhaps a notable failure rate of 4%, or 92 tanks trapped. He speculated that command might be seeking explanations. Arriving precisely at 1700 hours, he reported to Bradley's office, where the general, accompanied by several staff officers, awaited him. Bradley was holding a folder, its official letterhead clearly visible, and Culin immediately grasped that the summons was not related to any perceived failures. Bradley motioned him to a seat, and as Culin sat, the general opened the folder, sliding a document across the desk. It was a commendation for the Legion of Merit, signed by Bradley and co-signed by Major General Leonard J. Roth. "You are to be decorated with the Legion of Merit for exceptionally meritorious conduct," Bradley stated. "Your hedgerow clearing device directly contributed to the triumph of Operation Cobra and is estimated to have saved 1,500 American lives." Culin gazed at the document. The Legion of Merit was the fourth highest military distinction, typically awarded to officers for contributions at the campaign level, a rare honor for a sergeant. "Sir," he demurred, "I merely welded some steel to tanks." "You resolved a tactical impasse that had stalled the First Army for 6 weeks, Bradley countered. "Every tank commander from here to Paris knows your name. The device is officially designated the Culin hedge cutting device in Army records. You have earned this." The ceremony was held on August 20th, in a field near St. El. General Bradley himself affixed the medal to Cullin's uniform. Approximately 200 officers and enlisted personnel were in attendance, including several tank commanders whose crews had utilized the devices. Among them was Lieutenant Charles Green of the 747th Tank Battalion, who had successfully breached 47 hedgerows during Cobra without a single crew loss. The citation read aloud praised Cullin's remarkable ingenuity and technical skill in devising a mechanism that overcame formidable natural barriers, thereby facilitating the Allied advance through Normandy. It also noted the production of 2,850 devices and the projected reduction in casualties. News of the award resonated with other Allied forces. British tank units sought the technical specifications for the device. The British Army's 21st Army Group subsequently produced roughly 300 similar contraptions, referring to them as prongs rather than rhinos. Canadian armoured divisions manufactured 200 devices, utilizing scrap German steel salvaged from their own beachhead sectors. Technical drawings were transmitted to the Soviet Union via Lend-Lease channels, but they never adopted the design. Soviet tank doctrine prioritized overwhelming firepower over terrain adaptation. They addressed such obstacles by concentrating artillery barrages until the barriers were eliminated. The Culin device began appearing in training manuals by September. The Army's Armored Force School at Fort Knox integrated hedgerow breaching techniques into its curriculum. New tank crews were instructed in the tactical doctrine: approach at 25 miles per hour, strike the base of the hedgerow, maintain forward momentum for 15 seconds, clear the opposing side, and continue the advance. Field modifications persisted through the autumn of 1944. Some crews enhanced their devices with steel teeth for improved ground penetration, while others added angled deflector plates to prevent the prongs from snagging on buried obstructions. A few resourceful crews devised foldable versions that could be retracted when not in use. The devices saw limited application after Normandy, as the terrain beyond the hedgerow belts did not necessitate specialized breaching equipment. By October, most units had removed and stored their prongs. The infrequent hedgerow encounters in Belgium and Germany were managed with standard bulldozers or infantry explosives. Nevertheless, the tactical lesson endured: battlefield improvisation, leveraging available resources, could surmount challenges that had previously immobilized entire armies. Senior commanders began actively encouraging similar innovation. When American forces encountered anti-tank obstacles, such as the Dragon's Teeth, in Germany, engineers devised makeshift ramps constructed from rubble and steel beams, a precedent stemming from Cullin's solution to the beach obstacles. Culin rejoined the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron on August 25. His unit was then advancing through northern France toward Belgium, and he resumed his duties as a cavalry sergeant, without special treatment or a staff assignment, engaging in routine reconnaissance work. He participated in combat operations through September and October, with his unit crossing into Germany in November. The war was ongoing, and the Rhino tanks were largely forgotten by then, as new challenges demanded novel solutions. The hedgerow zone was situated 600 meters behind the front lines. The 102nd Cavalry reached the Elbe River in April of 1945. Germany surrendered on May 8. Culin had served 3 years in combat and was 30 years old. The war concluded, and he returned to the United States in June of 1945, receiving his discharge papers. The Legion of Merit was noted in his service record, as was his role in developing the hedgerow cutter. However, civilian life offered little regard for wartime innovations, and he needed employment. The trajectory of Cullin's post-war life would ultimately determine whether his contribution faded into obscurity or achieved lasting remembrance. Culin returned to Cranford, New Jersey, in July of 1945. He married Bernice Enright in September. They relocated to New York City, where he secured a position with Schenley Industries, a spirits company. The job bore no relation to tanks or military engineering, simply representing regular employment for a man endeavoring to reintegrate into civilian life. The hedgerow cutter narrative, however, followed him. Local newspapers published articles about the Cranford sergeant who had invented the device that broke the Normandy stalemate. The Cranford Citizen and Chronicle featured an article on September 7, 1944, while Culin was still in France, detailing how he had presented his plans to his captains and how General Bradley had deemed it revolutionary. Nevertheless, national recognition remained limited. The war continued through 1945, with other innovations and battles dominating the news coverage. The atomic bomb, victory in Europe, and victory in Japan all overshadowed the story. A tank modification from July of 1944 had become relegated to a historical footnote. General Bradley, however, altered this perception. He published his memoirs, A Soldier's Story, in 1951, which included detailed accounts of the hedgerow challenge and Cullin's solution. Bradley wrote that the device was so remarkably simple that it had perplexed an entire army for over 5 weeks. He specifically credited Culin by name and recounted witnessing the demonstration on July 13. The memoir reignited interest. Military historians began citing the Culin device as a prime example of field innovation resolving strategic issues. The Army's official history of the European theater, published in 1953, dedicated several paragraphs to the hedgerow cutters and their pivotal role in Operation Cobra. Yet, Culin himself remained relatively unknown outside military history circles. He continued working at Schenley Industries throughout the 1950s. He became a member of the Sons of the American Revolution, connecting with his family's Revolutionary War heritage through Colonel Curtis Grubb. He lived a quiet life in New York City, foregoing interviews and speaking engagements, simply living a regular existence. The tactical doctrine inspired by his innovation had a lasting influence. The Army revised its field manuals to emphasize improvised solutions utilizing available resources. Training programs instructed officers to encourage innovations from enlisted personnel rather than waiting for official equipment. The concept that a sergeant could effectively solve a strategic problem became deeply entrenched. NATO forces adopted similar methodologies. British, Canadian, and French armies developed their own protocols for field modifications. The Soviet Union, despite its initial rejection of the hedgerow cutter, began allowing greater tactical flexibility at lower command levels. The precedents established in Normandy profoundly influenced Cold War military doctrine. The actual devices largely vanished. A few Rhino tanks were preserved in museums. The Patent Museum at Fort Knox showcased a Sherman equipped with original hedgerow cutters. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans later acquired a similar example. However, the majority of the 2,850 devices were either scrapped or lost. The underlying engineering principles, however, endured. Modern combat engineers study the hedgerow cutter as a case study in rapid field adaptation. The principle of repurposing enemy obstacles as raw materials for friendly innovations is evident in current military training. Army engineers serving in Iraq and Afghanistan applied similar thinking when developing countermeasures against improvised explosive devices. Curtis Culin passed away on November 20, 1963, in Greenwich Village, Manhattan. He was 48 years old. His obituary in local newspapers mentioned his Legion of Merit and his involvement in developing the hedgerow cutter, but the notice was brief. Few individuals outside military history circles recalled the innovation or its significance. 1 year later, an unexpected event occurred. President Dwight Eisenhower granted a television interview to CBS correspondent Walter Cronkite on the 20th anniversary of D-Day. Cronkite inquired about the hedgerow challenge. Eisenhower recounted the story of the hedgerow cutter, identifying Culin by name and explaining how the device had transformed the campaign. The interview aired on June 6, 1964, reaching millions of Americans. Eisenhower's endorsement, delivered on national television by a former Supreme Allied commander, elevated the hedgerow cutter from a historical footnote to a legend. Culin was not alive to witness this recognition, but his contribution finally received the acknowledgement it deserved. The interview footage was filmed in the actual hedgerow country of Normandy. Eisenhower stood in a field near Saint-El, pointing out to Cronkite the location of the original demonstration. The hedgerows, still standing 20 years later, remained formidable 12-foot-high obstacles. Eisenhower explained how a single sergeant from New Jersey had solved a problem that had confounded an entire army. Official recognition had begun even before Operation Cobra concluded. On July 28, 1944, 1st Army Headquarters issued Technical Bulletin TBR 231. This bulletin officially designated the device as the hedgerow cutting device M1, Culin type. It included installation specifications, tactical employment guidelines, and maintenance procedures. This designation signified that the improvised modification had become standard Army equipment. Supply depots began stocking replacement prongs, and maintenance units were equipped with welding specifications. Training manuals incorporated the breech techniques. A field invention conceived in 3 days had entered official military doctrine within 3 weeks. The Third Army adopted the device upon becoming operational on August 1. General George Patton's forces received approximately 500 cutters for their advance across France. Patton's after-action reports credited the devices with enabling rapid movement through fragmented hedgerow terrain in Brittany and eastern France. The Ninth Army received technical specifications in September upon its deployment to Europe. They manufactured approximately 200 devices using salvaged German steel from fortifications. This production occurred at forward depots rather than on the Normandy beaches, demonstrating the concept's replicability wherever steel and welding equipment were available. The British 21st Army Group formally requested American technical assistance on August 5. British engineers visited the Culin production site and studied the design, subsequently creating their own variant, the prong device Mark I. Canadian forces developed similar equipment, designated obstacle cutter improvised Type A. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force issued a commendation for innovative field engineering on August 15, citing the hedgerow cutter as an exemplar of enlisted initiative solving operational challenges. SHAEF distributed this commendation to all Allied armies in Europe, emphasizing that tactical solutions could originate from any rank. Statistical analysis completed in September quantified the impact. The First Army's Operational Research Section compared casualty rates before and after the deployment of the Rhino tanks. Tank losses decreased from 8.3% per engagement to 4.7%. Crew casualties declined by 37%. The time required to traverse hedgerow terrain decreased by 73%. The economic calculation was equally significant. Each destroyed Sherman tank cost approximately $63,000 in 1944 currency, while each hedgerow cutter cost roughly $40 in scrap steel and 12 man-hours of labor. The devices saved an estimated 300 tanks during Cobra, representing $18.9 million in preserved equipment, not accounting for the value of trained crews. The Armored Force Board at Fort Knox reviewed the device in October of 1944. Their report recommended incorporating hedgerow breach training into basic tank crew qualification, a recommendation implemented in November. Every American tank crew trained thereafter learned Culin's techniques. Field Manual FM 17-33, the Armored Battalion, received an update in December of 1944, including an entire chapter on obstacle breaching using improvised cutting devices. Diagrams illustrated proper prong installation, tactical sections explained breach procedures, and maintenance sections covered field repairs. The doctrine extended beyond armored forces. Combat engineer training integrated the concept of utilizing enemy obstacles as raw materials. Infantry officers learned to identify suitable breach points for supporting armor, and artillery forward observers studied coordinated fire during hedgerow breaching operations. The long-term effect permeated Cold War doctrine. NATO forces planning for potential combat in Central Europe extensively studied the hedgerow campaign. Warsaw Pact defensive doctrine anticipated NATO forces employing similar improvised breaching equipment. Soviet military publications from the 1950s referenced the Culin device as an illustration of capitalist military adaptability. The U.S. Army's Combat Studies Institute utilized the hedgerow cutter as a teaching case from 1953 onward. Officer candidates at West Point analyzed the decision-making process leading to the device's adoption. Enlisted leadership courses emphasized that tactical problems could be solved at any rank through proper initiative. By 1960, the hedgerow cutter appeared in 16 different military training curricula across NATO armies. The total number of soldiers who studied this innovation exceeded 50,000. The concept that a single sergeant's sketch could alter the course of a campaign became institutionalized military knowledge. However, Curtis Culin never taught those classes, delivered those lectures, or saw the doctrine manuals bearing his name. He worked at Schenley Industries, lived quietly in New York, and died in 1963, 18 months before Eisenhower's television interview brought him widespread recognition. The question remained whether his contribution would be remembered beyond military circles or fade into the obscurity that claims most wartime innovations. The enduring legacy of Curtis Culin's invention resides in three domains: museum exhibits, military doctrine, and the memories of veterans who survived thanks to 4 steel prongs welded to tank bows. The Patent Museum at Fort Knox, Kentucky, displays an M4 Sherman equipped with original Culin-type hedgerow cutters. The accompanying plaque details the hedgerow problem and how a sergeant from New Jersey solved it using German beach obstacle steel. Approximately 30,000 visitors view this exhibit annually. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans acquired a similar Sherman in 2007. Its exhibit includes photographs of the production line at Columbia and copies of Bradley's original orders for mass production. Interactive displays enable visitors to grasp the engineering principles behind the prongs. The Musée de Débarquement in Normandy features a small section dedicated to American field innovations, exhibiting actual hedgerow cutter prongs recovered from abandoned tanks near Saint-El. While French visitors often overlook their significance, American veterans recognize their importance. Yet, the most crucial legacy is not found in museums but within doctrine. Every modern military force teaches the principle demonstrated by Culin: strategic problems can be overcome with available resources, tactical initiative, and 15 seconds of courage. This lesson has influenced equipment development, training protocols, and command philosophy for 80 years. The hedgerow cutter principle manifested in Iraq when soldiers welded scrap metal to Humvees for improvised armor protection. It reappeared in Afghanistan when engineers modified mine-resistant vehicles with field-fabricated components. It emerges whenever soldiers confront unforeseen tactical challenges and devise solutions without awaiting official equipment. Curtis Culin's grave is located in New Jersey. His headstone commemorates his military service and his Legion of Merit, but it makes no mention of the hedgerow cutter. Most individuals passing through the cemetery are unaware of who he was or what he accomplished. Yet, 1,500 men returned home from Normandy due to his invention. Those men had children, and those children had children. The number of individuals alive today because Curtis Culin welded salvaged beach debris to a tank in July of 1944 is incalculable, thousands, perhaps tens of thousands. He never knew this, dying under the belief that his contribution was a mere footnote. He held a regular job, lived a quiet life, sought no recognition, authored no memoirs, and granted no interviews, simply a sergeant from Cranford who identified a problem and resolved it. The last surviving member of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron passed away in 2019. His obituary mentioned serving alongside Curtis Culin. The veteran recalled witnessing the first hedgerow breach, stating it was the moment he knew they had survived Normandy. That is the true legacy, not the medals, not the museum displays, not the doctrine manuals, but the legacy measured in lives saved, 1,500 men who did not perish in burning Sherman tanks, 1,500 families reunited with their sons, husbands, and fathers. And it all began with a sergeant staring at scrap steel on a Norman beach, envisioning what those German obstacles could become if attached to American tanks. If this narrative has resonated with you as it has with us, please do us a favor and hit that like button. Every single like signals to YouTube to share this story with more viewers. Subscribe and activate notifications. We are dedicated to unearthing forgotten stories from dusty archives each week, tales of sergeants, mechanics, and ordinary soldiers who saved lives through ingenuity, courage, and 15 seconds of brilliance. Real people, real heroism. Please leave a comment right now and tell us your location. Are you watching from Texas, Germany, Australia, Japan? Our community spans the globe. You are not merely a viewer, you are an integral part of keeping these memories alive. Share your location. Let us know if anyone in your family served. Simply indicate that you are here. Thank you for watching and for ensuring that Curtis Culin is not silenced by obscurity. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping to make that a reality.